everybody. We are back in the office as we continue talking about books. Now, I finally went, of course, and remembered, long after I sent the last video, who I was talking about. And that, of course, right around 1446, was a guy by the name of Johann Gutenberg. Now, what Gutenberg invented was the movable type printing press. Now, this was really important because, again, as I had finished saying in the last video, this really helped to speed up the amount of books that we had. Remember, books were handwritten. One book would take 8, 9, sometimes 10 months to write one. So what that meant was that since there were so few books, there were so few people who actually needed to know how to read. I mean, can you imagine all of your neighbors, all of your friends, almost all of them not having the ability to read? Why? Because they didn't have to know how. There was nothing to read. Okay? Only the elites, the rich and powerful, the monarchies, especially in Europe, they're the only ones who had books. They're the only ones that needed to know how to read. Well, that was until Gutenberg came out with the movable type printing press. Well, now, of course, books start to be mass produced. Now, it wasn't surprising, as some of you may already know, that the first book massively produced by Gutenberg was, of course, the Gutenberg Bible. Gee, I wonder why that was there, Catholic Church. Sure, the Pope, the Catholic Church want to make sure if we're going to get something massively produced, like books, we're going to make sure it's the Word of God. And that's what the Roman Catholic Church did. And that's why a Gutenberg Bible, I think one of the original ones right now, could fetch you, I think, like $180 million. I mean, it's just worth outrageous price. But one of the things you also notice, I put it down already, I don't know why I put it down already, is you can see how you've got the two rows perfectly, and that is where the movable type press would put it. You would have these two rows, and then you'd have the letters that you would arrange into words and sentences, and then just lather it up, press it down onto the paper, boom, page one, boom, another page one, boom, another page one. And so now you could massively produce these books. Well, what that also meant is you now were going to have an educated society. Because in order to sell these books, or in order to spread the word about Christianity with the Bible, you had to make sure that people know how to read what you were giving them. So now education became huge. And it was never more important than when the first settlers came to America. Now, I'm sure you remember it was in 1620 that the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. Now, of course, we already had, in 1607, we had Jamestown, Virginia. We'd already had the Spanish conquistadors down in St. Augustine, Florida. But some of those first settlers was the Pilgrims. And in 1621, of course, is looked at as the first ever Thanksgiving. Well, one of the things that the Puritans, the Pilgrims, wanted to make sure is that when they came over here to create their own society, because they were being run out of Europe, they wanted to make sure that they had an educated society. And that's why it didn't take but 20 years after they landed that a company called the Cambridge Press published the first ever book in the New World. And of course, yes, it had the religious theme, and that is the Bay Psalm books, the Book of Psalms. Okay, and that's what it looked like. Interesting that in 1640, the company called the Cambridge Press, that location of the Cambridge Press would later become a place called Harvard University. All right, a little bit of history there for you. Now, this was very important because this idea that we need to have an educated society. We need a society that knows how to read and to write and to learn really affected how this country is today, because one of the direct descendants of the Pilgrims was our second president, John Adams. Now, John Adams was responsible for a lot of things. Unfortunately for some of you, he was also responsible for this. After the Revolutionary War, before he became vice president, John Adams was the first ever governor of Massachusetts. And it was John Adams that mandated that all children in Massachusetts must get an education. So remember when you were trying to cut school and the truant officer would call your parents and you were missing school? Blame John Adams. Because of course in America, and no matter where you go, you live, you have to have that right to an education, even if it's being homeschooled. Okay, but you have to. If you're not getting homeschooled, then they want you in a school. You have to be an educated child if you're in America. So that was something that came from the Pilgrims, and of course it came with barely getting their feet wet here in America, and they're already creating a book publishing company, the first one ever established here, and that is the Cambridge Press. So now, as the colonies are starting to grow here, okay, getting the word out, books are becoming very popular. It's not just, for example, the Gutenberg Bible, or Bibles, or Bay Psalms, and all these other psalms and other religious related. No, a lot of books of all kinds of things. Okay, a lot of entertainment books. One of the things about books, okay. Books can be unbelievably entertaining, and they were for a long time. It's all people had, but if you had things like fiction or things like, horror or comedy, of course, Shakespeare. By the time the 1700s rolls around, a lot of his stuff has now been put into books that people can read if they're not seeing the stage production, okay? So, people loved having books. The only problem was a lot of times it was expensive to buy a book. A little too expensive. So what we needed to have was a library. A place where you can go, where you could take out a book, read it, and when you're done with it, you don't have to purchase it, and you're not stuck with it. Oh man, I spent remember, in 1730, you spend $2 on a book, you finish that book, and now you got nothing to do with the book, you're out $2. That might be like a month's salary. I mean, $2 went a long way back in 1730. Well, one guy in particular, a young kid in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, he decides to start establishing something called a lending library. So what he did is he got a little room at a place in Philadelphia. You would come in, sign out for a book, take it home, read it, and when you were done, you would bring it back. And of course, if you were a couple of days late, you'd have to pay a few shillings, because we didn't have pennies back then. And here's a painting of that young man. Maybe you can see at the bottom without the glare. Yeah, it's a guy by the name of Benjamin Franklin. One of our great founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin. You're going to hear his name a lot in the next couple of weeks, because Ben Franklin was, he was responsible for a lot of stuff as we were establishing this great country. But yeah, if you go to any of your towns, you've got a public library. Almost every town I've ever been to, even the smallest little rinky-dink towns, there's a public library, thanks to Benjamin Franklin. Okay? Because this allowed people to become educated. But also to have that, entertainment value. A lot of times when people need to relax, of course, over this past 30, 40, 50 years, when people want to relax, they come home and at night they have dinner, and then, your dad, right, got that nice recliner he likes to sit in, or your grandfather too, right? Sit down, watch TV till they go to bed. And that's pretty much been the way it was for a long time, and still like that a lot for people probably 35 and over, or especially people who have children. You're not exactly going out at night after the children go to sleep, unless the grandparents live in the house. I wish I had that. Anyway, but what would happen is in these days, when you're talking about 1700s, as we get in towards the late 1700s, yeah, what you would do is you would do your work during the day, and of course we were an agriculture society. Almost everybody who lived in America at that time, except for some that, places like New York and Philadelphia and Boston had, little urban areas. But a lot of people did have farms. I mean, some of the biggest farms up until the 1890s, 1900s were in the Bronx. Okay? There people were farmers. And you farmed during the day, and then you came home, had your dinner, and then after dinner, the way your dad or your grandpa or mom go in to watch TV in prime time, they would sit down and they would read a book. And they would do this almost every night, and it was their form of entertainment. Okay? Now, as we're heading into the time where people like Benjamin Franklin and Sam Adams, the cousin of John Adams, and many other patriots are ready to break away from the British so we can establish ourselves. That all led up to, of course, April 19th, 1775. That, of course, is when the British were looking to steal some guns, and the people at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts stopped them. We had that first battle. The Revolutionary War has begun. Well, as we had then the Battle of Bunker Hill and a couple of other skirmishes, not everybody in the 13 colonies was all hunky-dory, because remember, a lot of people were of English descent, so it was almost like, well, if I fight against the crown, I'm fighting against my own people. So, what is the reason that we're doing this? Why are we fighting the British for this? In order to get people on board, in early 1776, a guy by the name of Thomas Paine writes a small little thin book. It wasn't a thick book, it was a thin book. And it was called Common Sense. Basically saying to people, this is the reason why we're doing it, and this is what common sense looked like. Okay? To the inhabitants of America from an Englishman. And it just laid out the reasons why we were fighting the British in the Revolutionary War. And it was a hugely popular book. Okay? And of course, this is where you start to see when, if you bought a book and you read it and you were done with it, you passed it around to other people. Okay? Something that we sometimes see today. Okay? And maybe, let's go back several years ago, somebody bought the Da Vinci Code, which was an immensely popular book. And after you finish reading it, you pass it on to your cousin or to your aunt or something like that. And I know some of you may not remember when the Da Vinci Code came out by Dan Brown, but it was a huge, we're talking in a time when books are starting to die out. I think it sold like 45 million copies. I mean, it was huge. And then, of course, you had a movie with Tom Hanks. But that's what was happening, is people were taking the book Common Sense and then passing it on. Now, where we also see books become very popular was when the Revolutionary War is over. Because now, after the war is over, yes, we now have 13 states in the United States of America, but now other things are opening up. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson makes the Louisiana Purchase. We tripled our country in size with the Louisiana Purchase. And then, of course, between the states and the Purchase were other lands, places like Ohio and Tennessee that we were now annexing. And the word came out, go west, young man. Well, if you're getting into a wagon, I'll tell you what, you get into a wagon and you go from here in Paramus to the New Jersey, Pennsylvania border, it's probably going to take you a day and a half if you're going by wagon, all right, with a couple of horses or oxen. Now imagine going to Ohio, or imagine going to the Oregon Trail and you want to get out to places out in the West. It's going to take you a long time. And of course, what came with you but books to help keep you entertained on the trip. And what's more is, as people were going out west, those who stayed back east only got an earful of what it was like out there. Of course, a lot of people didn't know what it was like. Hell, a lot of us, the American states didn't even know until 1805 when Lewis and Clark went out there, commissioned by President Jefferson, to then come back and tell us what's out there, because we didn't know. Okay? And, of course, as things progressed, into the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, and you have all these woodsmen and the native tribes and what was going on out there. What that ended up becoming is you then started to have people write books about that. So then people in the Northeast, and of course at this point the Northeast, our cities are getting bigger and much more populated. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. All right, people are now starting to almost work regular jobs. Okay, where you would get up in the morning, go to work, come home at night. Okay, after you were finished with dinner, you would then sit down and read a book. As a matter of fact, even in the smallest little apartments in like New York or in Philadelphia or something like that, you could have a small apartment. You didn't have to be a rich person, but in your house you would have one room, which would be the library. As a matter of fact, a lot of homes, even today, some fancier people, okay, if they have a house, they'll have a room, like some guys or women will have a den. And in that den, you'll have huge bookshelves with a bunch of books. Well, that's what a lot of people had back around starting in the mid-1840s. They would start to build these libraries, and that's where they would go, maybe have a pipe or a cigar or have some brandy to sip after dinner, and they would sit and they would read a book. Remember, there is no other mass medium right at this point. I mean, we're starting, of course, there is newspapers or magazines, but still, when it came to sitting for primetime TV, you want to be entertained. A lot of people were reading these books and reading about what it was like out in the wild, wild West. All right? Sold millions upon millions of books. But there was also something else. Even though we were now starting to expand out west, there was still one scourge in this country. Now, from the founding of this country, it had been something that we really, really needed to address. And that, of course, was slavery. This was not something that was accepted from the moment this country was founded. All right? The only thing was that in order to get some of the southern states with their large plantations to come with us and become the United States to fight against the British, we had to kind of turn our back to slavery, even though we were totally against it. As a matter of fact, I remember one of my all-time favorite book is the book John Adams by the great historian David McCullough. Some of you probably have never heard his name, but if you've ever seen the PBS documentary The Civil War, he is the narrator. And he's a wonderful historian. And David McCullough wrote this book about our second president, and it was always known that he, and especially his wife, Abigail Adams, were strong abolitionists. As a matter of fact, John Adams and his wife, he was the first president to walk in and live in the White House. And his wife was disgusted about going into that house because it was built by slaves. So this scourge really needed to be addressed. And as we got into the 1840s up to 1850, there was a lot of tension in the House of Representatives and the Senate. We really needed to get rid of slavery, and those in the southern states which relied on that slavery to raise their crops, they thought it was the only way they could do it and still make a profit. Crazy stuff. We just weren't seeing eye to eye on it. Who knows where the breakthrough was going to come through? Well, the breakthrough came with a book. And in 1852, a young lady by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, as you can see, this is the cover of the very first edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin was a fictitious account of what life was like on a southern plantation. And it was very real to a lot of people. Some of the worst things were some of the brutal ways that slave masters had treated the slaves. But what's more, really got to people is that some of the dialect, if you read the actual first editions, not the ones that were edited and cleaned up, that broken English that slaves would talk, I be doing this, the boss about to be, and it's like, how could people talk like that in America? How are we actually allowing this to happen? And a country like America, which in 1852 only had about, 30, maybe 35 million people, the first edition alone of Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 400,000 copies. That was in a country of about 35 million people, maybe 40 million people. Now I want you to imagine this. If today, in America, with 320 million people, if the first edition of your book sold 400,000 copies, you would be the talk of America. So imagine in 1852, and of course that was only the first edition, and they came other editions. Now remember, even though other editions are going to be printed, you still had 400,000 that first edition where after people read it, they passed it on to somebody else. Okay? And this was in 1852, and things moved pretty quickly after this, whether it's things that are going on in Washington or things going on in other states in the northern states, which of course then leads to, less than 8 years after the book is printed, we have this young man from Illinois who's going to run on a platform that is going to end slavery in America, and that of course was when Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860 wins the presidency of the United States, and immediately because he won the presidency and the South knew what he wanted to do, you start to see these southern states secede, which led to the Civil War. But that's how influential books could really be. Now we do see books today. There's talk of this book now that Bob Woodward, the former Washington Post writer, had put out with another Washington Post writer about what happened, during the 2020 election and afterwards with General Milley. Probably won't sell a lot of books because everybody already knows about it now. But especially, probably Uncle Tom's Cabin. When it comes to America, America's culture, the way we live, the way we progressed into becoming the greatest country the world has ever known, it starts with that book. I mean, that book really helped to change a lot of people's minds. Because again, people in the North may have been anti-slavery, but didn't know what the slave life was like. They didn't realize what was truly happening to these people down in the South until they read it. Even though it was a fictitious account. It wasn't based on a true story, but it was definitely someone, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author, who had been in the South and was reflecting on the things that she had seen, and that's what went into the book. And it truly did change and led, within 8 years, the election of Abraham Lincoln and the start of the Civil War. All right, I think I've bored you enough. You've got your quiz, your book quiz, so make sure you take that quiz. Have it to me by Sunday night at 8 p.m. Sunday night at 8 p.m. It is open book, so you can, of course, use your textbook to answer the questions on your quiz. All right, you guys, take care, and we shall see you soon.